Very happy to be here. Thank you for your invitation, Yanna and Rita. And so, as Diana said, I'm a historian and someone who's trying to think about this field of medical humanities. We'll talk about that later on. And I'm originally a historian of psychiatry and side disciplines. And I'm going to talk today about non-aligned psychiatry. I'm not sure if this is a misguiding title or misguided. But think about the relationship between psychiatry and side disciplines and psychoanalysis and psychotherapy will become very sort of common responding here. So the relationship between the side disciplines and politics and political ideology. And as Diana said, my first topic was about the relationship between war, violence, and political ideology through the lens of psychiatry and psychiatric discussions about the mind and human nature. And now I'm going to talk about the more recent research that also focuses on Yugoslavia in a global context, and particularly on the relationship between socialism or Marxism and side disciplines. And I think socialist psychiatry in Yugoslavia is really interesting. Very understudied, but really interesting because it was explicitly and deeply political and kind of consciously politicized and consciously asking or striving to become part of the political discussion, and because it really engaged with this concept of revolution, as is in the title, as we'll talk about more later, but the concept of revolution, but also concept of modernity and progress and sort of what it means to transform and revolutionize a society through revolutionizing psychological outlooks, right? That's the psyches of the population, right? So what is particularly also interesting in the context of global history, especially the second half of the 20th century, is that Yugoslav psychiatry is in between. A few years ago, there was a really interesting special issue where it was conceptualized around this concept of East Central European in-betweenness. And I'm thinking about in-between obviously psychiatry, because Yugoslavia had this particular this sort of special geopolitical position in the Cold War. Its psychiatrists and psychotherapists and psychoanalysts took great advantage.
That's fascism.
So they took advantage of the complexity and the multiple internationalizations and multiple international connections. So that its Marxist psychiatry, Yugoslavia's Marxist psychiatry, communist psychiatry was also paradoxically deeply westernized in order to sharpen its revolutionary edge. But it was also one of the only psychiatries, I think. This is very understudied, so things might come up later, but to my knowledge, this is the only East European psychiatry that actually actively engaged with the decolonizing world and with sort of building up psychiatric medicine in the decolonizing world. So we will talk about that, all of it. I'm just going to, was trying to be organized, so this is the structure of my talk. We talk first about primitivism. So the concept of revolution, which kind of structured my research here, is, as you will see, deeply connected with the concept of primitivism and the way it operates, and the way psychiatrists and other political thinkers and sort of socialist participants in the public debate conceptualize backgroundism and primitivism and their relationship with their own population, but also the relationship between revolution and primitivism. And sort of psychiatry is obsessed with primitivism, not only socialist psychiatry, but psychiatry in general. It's still very much is making up and inventing its new primitives among its patients, and Yugoslav and East Europeans or Balkan psychiatry in general is particularly has been forever particularly concerned with this concept of this figure of primitive patient, what to do with it. And what was interesting to me when I looked at Marxist psychiatry was that it did not change this. The concept of the figure of primitive patient continued to play pretty much the same role in a different ideological and political context after 1945. So we'll talk about the primitives and then how Yugoslav psychiatrists really conceptualized revolution and in its psychiatric sense or in its psychological sense. Talk a little bit about child psychiatry, because the thinking about revolution in psychiatry was particularly interesting and intense in the context of child psychiatry, because it was very important to revolutionize children's minds, to be able to build up Marxist citizens. And then we'll talk a little bit about how, in relation to child psychiatrists, child psychiatrists in particular, and psychotherapists and psychoanalysts really thought very deeply about what is specific and what is different about Yugoslav socialism as opposed to Stalinism, socialism, how to fight, how to combine revolutionary consciousness and, I guess, emancipation and liberation of the mind with the fight against authoritarianism. It's really quite interesting, sort of bordering on dissidence, but not quite. And then I will end by talking about non-alignment, or rather the involvement of the psychiatry with the decolonizing world and with the world outside of Europe. And so I really like this quote. This has nothing to do with Yugoslavia. This is Richard Keller's seminal work on colonial psychiatry in the French colonial psychiatry in North Africa. But I think it really summarizes something fundamental about Yugoslav psychiatry. So he said about French colonial psychiatrists, psychiatrists and patients in the Maghreb engaged in a protracted argument about incompatible approaches to illness. In their own minds, colonial psychiatrists occupied the front line in the struggle between Western biomedicine and what they considered to be superstitious tradition. And I actually think this can be applied to the Yugoslav case without much qualification, right? I mean, this really summarizes it. So psychiatrists throughout the 20th century, and I kind of dare to say this is true for the Balkans or for Eastern Europe in general, but psychiatrists, both pre-socialist or anti-communist and communist, did have a lot in common with their colonial counterparts, even though in the Yugoslav case there would be patients same culture, language, ethnicity, as you wish, but they were very much in that protracted struggle with them about the medical approach, about the interpretation of illness and interpretation and a kind of about beliefs, traditional superstitious beliefs, about therapies and what it means to treat and cure and heal mental illness. And in many ways, as I said, the primitive patient just sort of obsesses, Yugoslav psychiatry obsesses about its primitive patients. And most patients in the hospitals that I worked with, state hospitals were peasants, the poor, the illiterate, the semi-illiterate, politically illiterate. And these patients, the way psychiatrists treated these Ethiopian, their own peasant patients, was very much colonial in its ideological orientation. And that was the attitude that was supposed to be the distance. And I think that this kind of elite psychiatrists would be educated in France or in Germany or later on in the UK. And they were perhaps as far from the peasant patients as its colonial French psychiatrists were far from their patients in the Maghreb. So this is something to keep in mind. And I just wanted to talk briefly about language as a primitivism, because we run you through the whole 20th century in this one slide, but it's really something that is a thread, a kind of red thread throughout all these discussions that I looked at. And in the first half of the 20th century, this is this sort of overwhelming preoccupation with primitivism in patient files in psychiatric hospitals. And this is kind of what I'm quoting here is really typical. So this psychiatrist was talking about a woman. So over 75% of the patients in the 1930s in this hospital would be diagnosed with schizophrenia because it had something to do with intellectual deterioration and the failure of cognitive capacities. And so these alternative ways of thinking about mental illness, or thinking about the mind that these patients would propose, traditional beliefs, bad beliefs in magic, or lack of trust in biomedicine, right, would be interpreted as some kind of cognitive incapacity and intellectual deterioration. So this is kind of the primitive patient incapable of understanding abstract notions, with limited understanding, interpretation skills, unable to read, unable to count, unable to construct coherent sentences, and this constantly babbling incoherently. You have this sort of repeated references to babbling incoherently. And most of the patients would be described in these terms, and whether this is schizophrenia or this is some colonial psychiatric failed civilizing mission. It's unclear. And I think what I mentioned before is this what happens then in the 1940s is the war, of course, and that it changes political alliances and perhaps political contexts of this primitivism. But the socialist psychiatry, as I said, very much continues to work with these notions of backwardness and primitivism, civilization, so linear ideas of development and progress. And I worked a little bit on this concept of partisan hysteria or partisan neurosis, which is this really interesting diagnosis that appeared for a brief moment in 1943, 1944 in the Yugoslav communist resistance army, where the young soldiers started having seizures, epileptic form seizures, but they're not epileptic. Psychiatrists said in these seizures, these partisans were reenacting scenes from the battles, particularly traumatic scenes from the battles. And then this preoccupied psychiatry because it was so theatrical and continued happening after the war, and it was sort of anti-hierarchical in many ways. It would happen to authorities or in front of the authorities. And then when you get into the psychiatric debate about the partisan hysteria, it is all about primitivism. Right? It is all about the primitive young peasant soldiers who just could not cope either with their new tasks, because now they were getting their military ranks, officer ranks, and sometimes they were getting political. They were getting political tasks. No, they were very young, immature, constantly this reference to immaturity, childlike. Primitive peasants, uneducated soldiers, they don't know anything about Marxism, they don't know anything, and they are driven by the ambition. And this is Hugo Klein, who is actually quite some of you, if you know about Yugoslavia, you know him probably as theatre director after 1945, but he was a psychoanalyst actually from before the war, and he wrote a lot about partisan hysteria. Was preoccupied with it, and it was actually incredibly, compared to other military psychiatrists, it was incredibly benign. He was quite understanding, but he keeps mentioning this, that it was likely that the unenlightened nature of our peoples contributed to the spread of hysterical reactions in this war. This is sort of a left-wing perspective, and the whole debate about partisan hysteria kind of ended quite soon after this, after Hugo Klein's book. But it was dominated by this idea that the soldiers are simply not fit for their tasks because they're unenlightened, uncultured, uneducated, and sort of generally not mature enough. And they're peasants. And it was actually very much framed not about perhaps the trauma of the partisans, or this kind of kids, 16, 17-year-olds that went through 4 years of war and saw everything and lost everyone and everything. And so it was not about that at all. It was about how dangerous it is to give important tasks to the primitives, right? This is the dangers of the revolution, and this is what happens because now they can't keep up with the tasks, or they just can't do them. They can't be military officers, they can't be political commissars or whatever. Because they're simply not capable of it. So the revolution is kind of the social mobility, extreme social mobility of the revolution had this danger because of the spirits. And actually then the Yugoslav military psychiatrists came up with a lot of new ideas about how important they are to fight this problem, to fight them, to either more pessimistically to weed out the primitives from the military or from the society, or to train them, to educate them, to enlighten them, to enculture. And so this is how this happens at the very beginning of the socialist regime, and this is almost a sort of foundational diagnosis of the socialist psychiatry, new socialist psychiatry in Yugoslavia. It kind of disappears afterwards. There's a follow-up study in a Croatian journal which says in the 50s that parts of hysteria left no traces. They all grew out. And so this is kind of put aside. But again, the language of primitivism continues, and the problem of backwardness. And now when you come to this is 1945, Yugoslavia is still very much part of the Soviet political sphere. But by the 1950s and 1960s, it's a different, completely different setup, a much more kind of a more diverse and more open, you know, with open borders and therefore more open psychiatry in a sense, but still with strong links to the Soviets, to Soviets concerns and concepts and literature. But there's sort of much more engagement with, say, Western psychoanalysis in particular. It's quite interesting, the left-wing psychoanalysis in the West and these Marxists in Yugoslavia. So it's a different kind of psychiatry, but there is the same concern with the primitive mentality of the Yugoslav. And this is the kind of what I mentioned at the beginning, this concern with authoritarianism. So interesting in the 50s, especially in the 60s and 70s, these psychiatrists and become much more influenced by psychoanalysis and start thinking about socialism with the human face or the self-management, that's the work of self-management, and how it has to be different from Stalinism and the Soviet version of socialism. And they're really concerned by the authoritarian tendencies of the Yugoslav state itself and how it failed to, you know, how it sometimes, or often they thought, failed to live up to the promises of workers' self-management. So psychiatry again becomes very, very political. And consciously political as a site for revolution, for revolutionizing society, but also a site for building up revolutionary consciousness and sort of challenging some of that kind of authoritarianism and the need to obey that the Yugoslav state obviously also embodied, right? In its various its various aspects. But then again, this concern with the possible failure of self-management, the possible failure of communist democracy in Yugoslavia is again framed in terms of practice, right? And it is about the primitive mentality, the authoritarian, kind of Balkan authoritarian primitive families that don't know about the liberation and emancipation. And this is what our hero, one psychiatrist that we'll come back to throughout the talk, Vladimir Kovic, says that so there's a big role for psychiatry again in moving away, revolutionizing people means moving away from this primitive, obedient, authoritarian mentality, and it has to happen within the family, right? And so it has to move away from primitive family to nuclear families, characterized as civilized societies that just use civilized primitive really without any concern, without much reflection. And this is the core of social change, and the psychiatric profession has formed as to alleviate the psychological toll of this heroic leap from primitive communal society to socialism. So the families have to, and so this kind of, and as you see, I guess, in these, especially these last two examples, the concerns of primitivism remain the same, but they're not the same, they're recontextualized, but they remain, they linger, but and they're increasingly intertwined with this idea of what does revolution mean in the context of these primitive mentalities of primitive patience and backwardness. So we'll jump into, I'll talk just a little bit about these, the child psychiatry, because it's a big part of the book and a big part of my research. This is where I kind of started seeing this tendency, talking to these child psychiatrists, talk to some of the ones who are still around and still very engaged in these discussions and thinking about psychoanalysis and psychiatry. And as soon as I say, this became quite explicitly in if you read their writings, which I guess not many people did at the time because nothing happened to these people. The political dissidents, for instance, in the praxis groups were sometimes saying the same things in Yugoslavia, but they did encounter political problems and political repression, some degree of political repression from the Yugoslav state. And the psychiatrists were talking about the similar critiques of the state, and nothing ever happens to them. And they were, well, in general, nothing had happened to them. So but if you read their writings, they're explicitly political. And they, so my problem with psychiatry right now, I work with psychiatrists, apologize there, it's in the room, I know people are very different, but the psychiatrists I work with often are, quite reluctant to talk about engaging politics or political ideology. They think of their profession as neutral, and this is a sort of scientific requirement, standing alone as part of their professionalism, which of course is not true. You can't be outside of the political context. But what's fascinating about Marxist psychiatrists in Yugoslavia is how honest they were about their political engagement, about their political goals, and how they actually wanted to be part of that revolution explicitly in their textbooks or in their psychiatric writing, the way they talked about their cases. In other ways, psychiatrists do analyze their cases and write articles around their specific cases. And so this is the child psychiatry is really quite interesting, and it emerged in the 50s and 60s. I think it's a part of these contingencies and the serendipities that happen for individual people who choose a particular profession and then become really influential. But it becomes an important field, and especially in the 60s and 70s. It's very westernized. These people now go and train in the UK or in the US with either psychoanalysts or social psychiatrists and social psychotherapists in Tavistock in London, in Moseley Hospital in London and New York, also in France with the French psychoanalytic school or schools. And they come back, but they're not. They're not as if they're not as if we're repeating or kind of reinventing this British or American or French psychiatry in Yugoslavia. They're actually putting it in a particular context, and they're really concerned with what they see as these vocal families, right? The problematic vocal families that are at odds with the promise of this worker self-management of socialism, which is going to lead to this kind of early Marxist, the emancipation and freedom and liberation of each individual in a communist society. And they see the vocal families, and they're all very political themselves. So they talk about this as particularly, it's a little bit manipulative, but also politically very important at this time. And they talk about these authoritarian fathers who cannot be disobeyed as little Stalins in each family. And that's very sensitive because we hate Stalin. We don't want Stalins in our family. And so the problem, so if you talk to them, when I interview them and then I sort of reread their writings, it's kind of that becomes a problem, which is the kind of family structure, the way people deal with their children, in the way people deny freedom, creativity, or emancipation to their children because of that kind of. This comes back to the peasant's mentality, and that's why they keep saying it's impossible to build the society that we want to build that is neither capitalist nor Stalinist, right? It's impossible to build them if you raise your children like this, right? And so in that sense, when they write about their family therapies and their clinics, and their family or their child clinics, child therapy clinics, they talk about revolution. And so that in that sense, they bring this, because what quite often psychiatry or psychoanalysis even is accused of individualizing and depoliticizing, desocializing social and political problems. But in this case, they were obviously individualizing that because they were working with individual psyches, but they were making it part of the broader, linking it directly to this broader issue of socialism and what it means to be a democratic socialist or a democratic Marxist society. And so this is the father, the Stalin of child psychiatry in Yugoslavia. This is psychoanalysis for Antić, who and this is kind of, I really like this quote because he puts it forward very early on. So he was going to do his training in St. Peter, in Leningrad in 48, and then it all fell apart, and then he chose randomly to do, well, he just chose another one of the very few fellowships that remained, and it was in Paris in a child psychoanalytic clinic, and that he brought this back with him. But I think here he's really saying something explicitly political and less not psychiatric at all. This is, we're entering a society in which every individual carries his share of responsibility, in which awareness, pleasure derived from labor, and true personal education are more necessary than ever, in which every individual will make decisions about economic, foreign, internal policies, about war and peace. In such a society, every individual should be raised in such a way as to be able to be involved in a community without fear or aggression, keeping the originality of his personality and feeling of personal freedom. So what is he talking about here? I think it's a very interesting, I mean, it's kind of, I think it's explicit take on sort of early humanist Marxism, where he kind of imagines how this new society that's, I guess, like neither Stalinist nor capitalist, is going to, what kind of people do we need for these societies and this society to work? So everybody has to be involved in, this is the kind of direct people's democracy, and, but also everybody has to feel it's this kind of pleasure, right, and happiness and dedication, freedom, authenticity of personality. And so you can't raise children by beating them and telling them they need to obey the father because it's the father. Right? And so this is how Antić, who's the another one I actually is still alive and really actually sharp still. And talking about she wrote such explicitly political and sharp things in her psychiatric work, and that they were never engaged in kind of political work. I guess they were party members, but no more than that. But this is what she writes, and expressions of disobedience and resistance to parents, etc. So all kinds of authorities, right, teachers and other adults, especially their position higher on the hierarchical scale, are condemned and punished, while obedience and submissiveness are encouraged. Parents and adults are sacred beings who may not be called in question or disputed. And for her, this is at the core of the problem. This is why it's never going to work if it continues like that. And if you talk to her now, she goes, this was our main problem, how to reform this family, because it was not going to this society that Antić was talking about was never going to be possible. Sorry. Anyway, this society that Antić was talking about was never going to be possible with this kind of, the sacred nature of all authority. So it's really quite interesting. So people would bring their children to these people, and then they would quite explicitly encourage children to disobey and not to listen to parents. And once there is a conflict, and once there is sort of open disobedience, an open conflict, and a child stands up to or an adolescent stands up to their parents, then this is the parents come to complain to the psychiatrist, and the psychiatrist is like, well, this is now, we've achieved our goal, right? And so the encouragement to disobedience is quite interesting. So here is the political vocabulary in psychiatric treatises. A child who grew up in a democratic family acts in a free way, not withdrawn, normally cheerful. A child, on the other hand, who grew up in a non-democratic family demonstrates in their social behavior the exact opposite characteristics. And then so this is a patient from a child who was growing up in a quite a traditional, it's got an extended family with grandparents and parents, and everybody was an authority, and the child was worthless and voiceless, and the child was trying to kill himself, and he was right. He was also a 5 or 6 year old who was drawing these trucks because he was trying to kill he's fantasizing about killing himself, and this is really something that the psychiatrist writes about in their work. So this is what you produce. You need to get far away from this family. And so this is this is one of my favorite quotes, because she says psychotherapists must be aware of a trap where they kind of become part of this repressive mechanism. So this is then bringing these psychiatrists very close to radical psychiatry that was happening in the US and Western Europe, and New York in particular, and this kind of critique of psychiatry as an essential part of the oppressive system, all these repressive mechanisms, alongside with family and police and government in general. So this is like, we have to be aware of a trap in which we're told to become a protector and advocate of the interests of the family and of the society, and to serve their interests uncritically. Parents should take responsibility for their part in the development of mental disturbances in children and in youth. And sending a child to a therapist could be the last and most decisive pressure and enslavement. The therapist should not act like a person who offers freedom to the enslaved, while smiling at and encouraging the enslaver. So the family is not even, the repression, the familial repression is feudal, or even earlier than that. It's enslavement, and what we need is liberatory radical psychiatry. And I mean, radical psychiatry is very important, linked to this sort of movement of anti-psychiatry across the world. But it seems to me this is the only case, perhaps one of the few cases, where this branch of radical psychiatry, wasn't explicitly called radical psychiatry, it was very much like radical psychiatry. It was part of the state system, so you could, it was funded by the state. You could go and see these people as a as part of your general referral if you wanted to see a psychiatrist, or if you're sent to see a psychiatrist. So this is very much at the core of what the socialist psychiatry is. And here we have Kovacevic, who's a very interesting young psychiatrist at this time, also very interested in French psychoanalysis. He comes to this psychoanalysis, and this is how he translates various psychoanalytic works or comments on Freud and other publications in celebration at this time, and he defines the role, right? And they keep saying we can't be in an ivory tower, we can't be in our clinics without being engaged with the broader mission. He says, just like revolutionary Marxist praxis, engaged psychoanalytic practice aims to help individuals become freer of their own social history, shedding light on the forms and conditions of their alienation and the possibilities for overcoming it. It's also very strange that, in the context of the history of psychiatry, and maybe this is not our main concern here, but it's very notable that they talk about psychoanalysis so openly in a socialist country at this time. This is a unique case. But it's also a civilizing mission of sorts. It's very progressive and revolutionary, but they clearly have a mission to civilize, or to enlighten, a particular, society or a social group, or the families that come to them to seek out and ultimately to enlighten the mentality. To change the mentality, and it is very different politically and ideologically, contextually, but it can be linked back to what was happening with parts and hysterics and what was happening with the early 20th century psychiatry struggling. So they keep running into the problem of the primitive patient that they have to work with. In some way, in this case, the primitive patient is directly kind of an obstacle to the development of the socialist society and to the development of the revolution in the way that it was imagined in these kind of far left circles. But this is, I'll come back to this. So this is what's happening inside the country, so to speak, and they're very inward-looking in a way, but then it is really I think important to ask the questions of, once these people, and Kovacevic in particular, once these people go and try to engage with, because obviously what's happening is not only the Cold War and the ideological struggle between Stalinism or Soviets, the Soviet bloc and the Western bloc, and Yugoslavia somewhere in between. But what's happening alongside the Cold War, of course, is decolonization and sort of non-alignment. And these two things are often discussed separately, but in this case, they come together in the figures of these psychiatrists, and particularly Decolonization himself, who will go and try to set up a whole new, psychiatric system in Guinea in the 1960s. So what happens with these people when they deal with the decolonizing world, when they engage with debates about colonialism and decolonization, and when they go and try to enlighten and civilize the decolonizing world in the same way they were civilizing their own society and their own patients? It's really quite interesting, because I think, so what happens, I'm going to talk about this, is my case study was Vladimir Yakovlevich, who was one of the Francophile psychiatrists. Most of them were actually oriented towards the English-speaking world at this time, but Yakovlevich was very engaged in French debates and did his training in Paris. And through Paris and through French psychoanalysis and through French radical psychotherapy, got involved in the debates about colonialism and decolonization, and then ended up sent by Yugoslavia on a mission to Guinea where from a French colony, where he spent more than 3 years, or around 3 years, and setting up psychiatrists in Guinea, in Conakry. And so it's really quite interesting. So we don't have other examples. So we have a lot of examples of medical missions and other medical doctors from Eastern Europe, Socialist Eastern Europe, and Yugoslavia, to various parts of Africa and Asia, but not psychiatrists. And so this is one case where we have a psychiatrist. It happens to be this kind of strange socialist psychiatry, not so typical socialist psychiatry, this kind of Frenchified revolutionary psychoanalysis being sent to Guinea. And so what does he do? It's really quite interesting it's a whole other debate about the problems and internal contradictions of socialism and socialist bloc's engagement with decolonization, and to what extent they managed to overcome the colonial the fundamental assumptions of colonialism. And then when it comes to Yugoslavia in particular, discussions about non-alignment, and whether non-alignment genuinely takes Yugoslavia south, right? It brings it genuinely to the south and changes and reforms this sort of colonial European colonial ways of thinking about the global south of the third world, or not, right? And Yakovlevich and his Guinea expedition is a good example, because it's really complicated. So there's no answer to this question, sorry. But it's very complicated, it's very internally contradictory. So so we see when he comes to Guinea, he comes with this baggage that I was talking about, right? So revolutionary, the ideas about emancipation, but also in a global context, critique, quite explicit critique of Western colonialism, racism, failed Western projects. Socialism has something different to offer. Is it that different? But the way they write about their own patients, right, in Yugoslavia, is quite problematic. And as I mentioned in the very beginning, this Richard Keller's quote, they were not the way they write about, when Yugoslav psychiatrists write about and treat their peasant patients in Yugoslavia is not so different from the way conceptually the French psychiatrists, colonial psychiatrists thought about their own patients in the Maghreb. So what can happen with these binaries of primitivism and civilization, with these linear ideas of historical progress? What happens with them when they take them out into these formerly colonial areas? Well, a mess happens. And it's interesting that so Yakovlevich wrote a lot. He was educated in Croatia, but then he wrote a lot about Macedonia, which was the southernmost part of Yugoslavia, and so very rural, very agricultural at this time. And for him, Macedonia is. I mean, there's a long history, really colonial history of Serbia with Macedonia from before the Second World War. But the way he writes about Macedonia, before he goes to Guinea and after he goes to Guinea, is exactly how colonial psychiatrists used to write about colonial, the primitive colonial populations, right? And so the primitivism, the backwardness of civilization, this idea of a linear progress, and this is what sort of people have written also in the, for instance, in the Soviet case, and their engagement with the global south, with the decolonizing world, is this kind of Marxist revolutionary politics that goes hand in hand with state paternalism and this idea of sort of hurrying up, speeding up certain peoples along this Marxist scale of progress, and a civilizational scale, and that's what happened in Yugoslavia, and kind of what Yakovlevich brings with him to Guinea. As Matt McGovern wrote about in his book about Guinea itself and its own political elites and this post-colonial Guinea and the way it struggled with modernity and development, right? And when socialists came in, they also insisted on a single path to modernity. And even though socialism identified problems of critiqued exploitation within European modernity, it did not hesitate to treat non-European societies with Eurocentric disdain. And if you read psychiatrists like Yakovlevich and the others, they kind of place Yugoslavia quite often firmly in Europe. There's some differences, but Yugoslavia has the same structures, the same psychological structures, the same incidence of mental illnesses, which is it's very important how frequent schizophrenia is, because if it's frequent, then it's civilized, etc. And so it is like that. But then I think what is interesting here, and I have this non-psychiatric image from Tito's visit to Tunisia in '65, where one of the signs it says we want our, this alliance and brotherhood between Yugoslavia and Tunisia and Algeria in the background at the time. We won in our struggle for freedom, right? Yugoslavs against the fascists, the Tunisians and Algerians against the colonial authorities. We will win in our struggle against backwardness as well. And so this is the whole project, the state project, fighting backwardness. And they wouldn't say primitivism here, but this is what they were saying in the writings, the psychiatrists. But I think what changes, what's unique perhaps about socialist psychiatrists or Yugoslav psychiatrists in Guinea and the rest of the, elsewhere in the non-aligned world, perhaps, was that they felt there was a unique kind of solidarity, because ultimately, even though Yugoslavia was officially part of the European family of modern nations, bit backward, but not quite outside Europe, right? There was this kind of unique sense of solidarity that they were both. There was a unique comparability between the Yugoslav, for instance, and Tunisian and Guinean experiences, and it is that comparability that ultimately, I think, makes the socialist non-aligned psychiatry somewhat more progressive than the Western. I mean, Western post-colonial psychiatry is almost equally racist as colonial psychiatry, so it's not a great leap until the 70s or 80s at least, and even afterwards. So I think in the case of Yugoslavs, in the case of the socialism, there's this kind of the sense that they are in fact in the same boat, in the sense that they can see very similar notions of very similar phenomena of backwardness and primitivism that they need to fight against. I think that kind of makes Yugoslav psychiatry still different, still a bit more different, a bit less racist, or a bit less colonial than their Western counterparts, if that makes sense. So as I say, Coleridge wrote a lot about Macedonia and about his other Yugoslav patients. This is just the Donka Hospital in Conakry where he worked, or where he was building up the psychiatric wing. And he puts, so this obviously will never happen with the British or French psychiatrists in a colonial context, but he puts the Yugoslav population and Guinean population in the same, in the same frame, right? So both Guinea and Macedonia are, he says, superficially westernized, intimately traditional, superficially rational, intimately irrational, superficially controlled, fundamentally impulsive. It's really quite interesting that the new was permanently pregnant with the old, and they were, the fights that the two countries are ultimately the distance, the civilizational distance between the two isn't really there. It doesn't exist in the one with Europeans. A different kinds of Europeans, the Yugoslavs were, precisely because of this comparability of the patient. There are other ways. So I took this out from actually an article. I used to go around PD stores and freak Yugoslav scholars out, because this is what he writes about. It's from a Coleridge article, and they know it's about Guinea. Like he was in Guinea, and so all he wrote, and then I revealed that it's an article which is exclusively about Macedonia. Right? So he was writing this about his Macedonian patients, right? But he was using the same language and the same concepts to write about to write about Guinean patients, but also he did not only psychiatric work, but ethnographic research in Guinea. He used this time there. So both Guinea and Macedonia, totemistic beliefs, rituals, extreme patriarchy in families. Remember, this is what they despaired over in Yugoslav psychiatry forever. Open aggression, blood vengeance, buying of women who are evaluated as merchandise, submissiveness of women and of children, archaic social structures, backwardness, collective psyche. This is also directly taken from colonial psychiatric registers, the collective psyche, the lack of individuation, differentiation, etc. And then at the forefront of Western biomedicine, right, bizarre medications that were connected with religious origins, Oriental lifestyle in Macedonia as well as in Guinea. But it's kind of the idea, this alternative idea about mental illness, no? that magic and religious belief that psychiatrists, colonial, post-colonial, communists, non-communists were extremely sensitive to, right? And so these are these parallels, and I think it, as I said, I'm repeating myself, but it does, we can talk about this, it does something to their quasi-colonial orientation. It does something to Yakovlevitch's own the kind of outlook on civilization and civilizational scales, because the political identity of Yugoslavia is constantly shifting. So there's a lot of work about this non-alignment and how it affected or it did not affect the internal racism, etc. But as we can see here, the psychiatric identity of Yugoslavia or psychological identity of Yugoslavia is also constantly shifting. It's constantly bringing us back, closer or farther from Guinea or countries comparable to Guinea. Okay, and this is the end. The final slide. Oh, it's very dense now. Oh. Not working. So if I want to wrap this up together, I mean, we the idea that the psychiatrists struggled with in the 50s and 60s and 70s in Yugoslavia with their own patients, not only with Macedonians, but with patients from all kinds of child patients, the families, these authoritarian Balkan families, right? I think that these concerns then play a very important role in the way these people then conceptualize the non-European world. And if you look at that, he says, what is different, I guess, also about this socialist psychiatry is different from colonial psychiatry, from Western psychiatry, is that there is a bit more optimism about the ability of primitives to catch up with the civilized society. Because if the pre-war psychiatry in Yugoslavia was quite pessimistic. They couldn't do anything with their primitive patients in hospitals. They couldn't treat them, couldn't get to them. It was all lost. It's predetermined failure. And it was quite often in colonial psychiatry, even if it was kind of nominally optimistic and thinking about the civilizing mission and progress, it was unimaginable that if you place a people, if you place a society lower on a civilization scale, how is it possible that people can jump over centuries to catch up with the civilized world? In this brand of psychiatry, there is more optimism and of course, if you would accept this kind of colonial pessimism about the ability of primitives to be educated or developed or civilized, then Yugoslavia would be, that project of Yugoslavia would completely fail. I mean, it would be completely pointless to even try, right? And so Yugoslavia was on its way to do the same as Guinea, and so what he says, our experiences from Yugoslavia have clearly demonstrated that a primitive personality who's young and capable enough can successfully integrate in a technically and culturally developed environment, even though that integration might be accompanied by temporary mental disorders. And if you remember the parts of hysterics, they struggled for a few years or a few months, and then 10 years later, they were all cured. They all caught up, they got mature, they got educated, they learned about Marxism, and they caught up, right? And so there is this optimism, this idea that the civilization scales are not as predetermined or far away from each other as they were in colonial psychiatry, or even in this pre-socialist Yugoslav psychiatry. And what comes out of all of this is this is not, perhaps this should be more widely known, but really strikes me as the original contribution of this Marxist psychiatry is this theory of revolutionary personality. And if you think about that, it comes out of Yakovlevitch's writing in dialogue with Frank Psychoanalysis, but also very much shaped by his experiences in both Macedonia, Yugoslavia, and in Guinea, where he sort of develops this idea that it's non-conformity, that it's the clash, the conflict with society, which is traditionally cause of neurosis and psychiatric problems, the psychological problems. Now, in this theory, this Marxist psychiatry, it is the non-conformity, the clash, the conflict is the way forward, and that is the sign of psychological health. I think that's very much applicable to these families the child psychiatry in Yugoslavia, the non-conformist children will save the society, and also in the context of decolonization, because you have to, you're only healthy if you stand up to the colonial state, right? Or if you stand up to the fascist state in the Second World War in Yugoslavia. And he talks about these creative potentials that are embedded in conflicts. And says socially caused conflicts might constitute a progressive factor in the development of society. Not neurosis, realness, but society. I think this is quite radical. Pathogenic social and political situations were not necessarily destructive. To the contrary, certain personalities might be stimulated by such settings to develop creatively new forms of reacting, creation of novel political forms in the context of fighting colonialism instead of performance subordination. So he says, if you're stuck in a backward society, in that society can obviously colonial society in the Guinean case, but fascist society, no, disoccupied society in the Yugoslav case, or backward society, any kind of non-communist society is backward. So if you're stuck in a backward society, if the only healthy personality is the personality that is in conflict, right? It's experiencing this intense conflict with the social structures. And conformism is a sign of weakness, right? Because you are conforming to the ill, pathological, pathogenic society. And this is kind of flipping traditional psychiatry. And even psychoanalysis is on its head, right? Upside down. Anyway, but it is a production, I think, of both internal struggle for enlightenment and civilization against primitivism, and these experiences with decolonization in former colonial territories. So I'll end here, and I'll have a chance for your questions.